A new solar-powered cell phone charging station at the University of Houston is teaching sustainability one charge at a time.
This is a perfect way to sort of memorialize our efforts to bring sustainability education to our students and really bring it in a very real way rather than go and lecture about it in classes.
It is all part of the university's goal of a more sustainable campus.
Each individual can make a difference. You don't need a collective response for an issue like sustainability. Each individual can make a choice, and they can make this choice in a manner where it does not necessarily cost them a lot.
And the response from the community has been encouraging.
This is clearly a message to our students, faculty, as well as staff that UH is serious about the issue of sustainability. And really, energy and sustainability go together. If there are places where sustainability can work, let's make it work.
This University of Houston Energy Symposium is sponsored by ExxonMobil. Every year, UH Energy brings critical issues in energy to the university in our annual symposium series. This year, the first topic is the Arctic, untapped opportunity or risky business. With low energy prices and substantial economic growth, consumer demand for energy has exponentially increased across the globe. Economic advancement over the last 200 years has strongly correlated with increased energy consumption. With the world's population expected to grow to 9 billion by 2050, energy demand is expected to significantly increase over the next several decades. The International Energy Agency estimates that the world demand for oil would increase by roughly 1.4 million barrels a day in 2015. To accommodate this rising demand, oil companies are exploring areas of the Arctic for untapped resources. The Arctic contains an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and about 30% of its undiscovered conventional natural gas. Operators are already drilling over land in the Arctic. About 1/3 of Arctic area reserves in shallow water have been lightly explored, even though it is the largest geographic area on Earth with a vast amount of probable resources. In 2012, Shell attempted to begin drilling in the Arctic. The Kulik and the Noble Discoverer, two of the oldest drill ships, were hurriedly refurbished and sent to sea. Both drilling ships saw torrential storms, creating a domino effect of complications. The Discoverer immediately saw multiple equipment failures and the ship was impounded by the Coast Guard. Eventually, the Kulik also became unmanageable and let loose, wrecking on the shore of an uninhabited island in the Pacific. In the U.S., the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, manages the exploration and development of offshore energy and marine mineral resources. Their operation covers the continental shelf and the Arctic, the area off of the Alaskan coast that lies within 200 nautical miles. BOEM regularly releases a 5-year plan for the sale of oil and gas leases. Before an area is proposed for leasing and included in the 5-year plan, 7 factors must be considered, from the environmental sensitivity to the laws and policies of the affected states involved. An environmental impact study is prepared and the public is provided with a number of opportunities to comment on the proposed activity. The most recent 5-year plan included the sale of leases in the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea, above the Arctic Circle off of the northern coast of Alaska. Nearly 120 million acres with an estimated 25 billion barrels of oil and 120 trillion cubic feet of natural gas exist in probable reserves. In 2007, the environmental impact study was drafted for the proposed lease areas and open for public comment. The sale was contested in court and prompted a supplemental environmental impact study. The second study was released in February 2015 and included a hypothetical long-term scenario over the full life of all leases included in the Chukchi Sea. It determined that future development brings a 75% chance of one or more spills of over 1,000 barrels of oil, a figure that has attracted attention from the media and stakeholders. In March of this year, the Department of the Interior upheld the schedule of lease sales and in May approved Shell's exploration plan. In August, Shell was granted the final permit, allowing the corporation the approval to drill below the ocean floor. Questions on the safety of drilling in the Arctic are still being contested, and we invite you to join us on September 24th at 5:30 p.m. in the UH Student Center South Houston room. The symposium will feature a panel of guest speakers, including Jed Hamilton, Senior Arctic Consultant at ExxonMobil, Kevin Harun, Arctic Program Director at Pacific Environment, Bob Reiss, American author of Nonfiction and consultant on Arctic issues, and Peter Van Tine, Managing Partner at Bessenyey and Van Tine L.L.C. Moderating this symposium is Richard Haut, Senior Research Scientist at the Houston Advanced Research Center.
So good evening. My name is Ramanan Krishnamurthy. I'm the Chief Energy Officer at the University of Houston. That title sounds exactly right because that's the only way I'll be CEO anywhere in the world. So I like that. So welcome to the first event in our series, our Energy Symposium series. This is the third year that we're running this. It's called Critical Issues in Energy. Tonight's topic, and I'm sure all of you know it, Arctic drilling, untapped opportunity or risky business. The symposium itself is presented by ExxonMobil. We want to thank them for being our sponsor today. They've also provided us an excellent speaker, Jed Hamilton, who's here, and they've really made this event possible. We also want to thank several of the representatives from Exxon who are here. I understand we have John Harrington, Carol Lloyd, and Ram Sitaram, one of our alumnus from chemical engineering here. So if you're here, please stand up and be recognized, but otherwise we'll move on. We want to thank a couple of our media sponsors. One is Houston Public Media, who is making a lot of this possible, and the other one is Houston Chronicle. Both of them have helped spread the word. I don't know, many of you caught yesterday's Houston Matters segment. Some of our speakers were on there, and we really want to thank them for their support. And most of all, we want to thank all of you for being here and supporting this event and being here for a rather interesting discussion on the Arctic. We'd like to recognize a few people from our Energy Advisory Board. I think Paul Siegley from our Energy Advisory Board representing Chevron is here. He probably is running a few minutes late, but the Energy Advisory Board has been the core genesis of this entire symposium series. They are the ones who sort of gelled us together and brought us together here. We've created something really brand new at UH Energy this year. We've created a fellows program. And we've got our inaugural batch of fellows here. I'm going to call out your name. Please stand up. I know many of you are here, so don't be shy. So Ray Klein from the College of Technology, Christine Economides from Petroleum Engineering, Andrew Hamilton from our Energy and Sustainability Program and the Honors College, not here at this point, Tracy Hester from our College of Law, Ed Hers from Economics and Business, Catherine Horn from Education, and Rob Stewart from Geosciences. And we really appreciate them being a part of this program. The Fellows Program is really a way to bring the thought leaders from UH to the forefront and showcase their efforts in a manner that is approachable and readable for the general public. And so they'll be posting blogs and video logs. Look forward to that on our website. Several groups who have helped actually make this happen are student ambassadors and our Energy Coalition volunteers. Outstanding work by them. I really want to thank them for all their work that they put in. One sort of, you'll see sort of a slightly different way we're going to handle the Q&A part of the discussion. We have Jennifer Dewey from the Houston Chronicle, who's up here in the front row. She'll be facilitating that. And you've got two ways of sending in your questions. We strongly encourage you to use the electronic way and submit your questions online through uh.edu/energy. It's up there. Very simple. You'll see an interactive screen there. It works beautifully on smartphones and iPads, so please use that. Or if you prefer to do it the old-fashioned way, we'll have some index cards floating around that will get to you. Just identify yourself and we'll get you those index cards. And that'll be a great way to sort of get the conversation going. So thank you all for bearing with me with all that introductory side. Now, without further delay, let me introduce Rich Haut. Rich is the Director of Energy Production for the Houston Advanced Research Center, affectionately known to all of us as HARC. He has over 30 years of experience in the energy industry, 10 years in the North Sea drilling and completion operations in Norway and Scotland. He's received many awards from the DOE. He's been awarded 36 patents. He's been invited to address Congress about environmentally sound energy production, and he's the PI for the Environmentally Friendly Drilling Consortium. Without any further delay, Rich, it's yours.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here this evening and seeing everybody packing the house here as well. So for more than 80 years, oil and gas companies have been operating in Arctic environments. Offshore Arctic oil and gas exploration began in Alaska in the Canadian Beaufort Sea almost 50 years ago in the 1960s with the construction of artificial gravel islands in shallow Alaskan state waters. Similar activities took place in the McKenzie River Delta in the early 1970s. Now, Alaska's North Slope alone has produced over 17 billion barrels of oil that have been shipped to domestic ports in California and Washington. Back in 2012, Secretary of State George Shultz stated that the exploitation of the Arctic will open a whole new ocean for human activity and knowledge, with the region's vast energy, mineral, and marine resources, fueling technological innovations no less revolutionary than the impact of the discovery of the Pacific on the Old World. Well, the Arctic poses a unique operating environment characterized by its remoteness, the lack of supporting infrastructure, the presence of sea ice, extended periods of darkness and cold, and hurricane-strength storms. In addition, a diverse natural ecosystem and the presence of indigenous communities call for the highest standard of environmental protection and responsible development. Is the U.S. and other nations prepared to meet the challenge? There will be an Arctic in the future, but what will it be like? Today's discussion may help each of us develop a vision of that future. Well, it's a true privilege of mine to be joined today by 4 leading experts on the Arctic to help us develop that vision. Jed Hamilton, located here on my far right, is the Senior Arctic Consultant with ExxonMobil, helping to define research and development programs. Jed has worked in ExxonMobil's Arctic Technology Program since 1999, when he began developing ICE design criteria for offshore facilities and pipelines. He served as chair of the Technology and Operations Subgroup, responsible for 4 chapters of the National Petroleum Council 2015 report on U.S. Arctic oil and gas development potential. His recent publications concern ice gouging effects on Arctic pipelines and ice management for floating drilling operations in Arctic waters. Next to him is Kevin Harun. He is an Arctic Program Director for Pacific Environmental, where he works to support sustainable development through political and nonprofit advocacy and leads his organization's delegation through its permanent consultant status at the International Maritime Organization. Most recently, he worked as Sustainability Director for the City of Anchorage. Kevin served 2 terms on the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly, where he represented a diverse constituency of rural and urban residents. He also served for 7 years as the Executive Director of the Alaska Center for the Environment and was previously the Program Officer of Forestry, Oceans, and Arctic Programs at the Alaska Conservation Foundation. Now, immediately to my left is Bob Reiss, an American author, journalist, former Chicago Tribune reporter, and a former correspondent for Outside Magazine. For the past 5 years, he has focused on Arctic issues and authored a fantastic book entitled The Eskimo and the Oil Man. This book reflects upon the various aspects on balancing energy development, environmental protection, and the resiliency of local communities as we grapple with our love of cheap fuel and the romance of pristine wilderness. Finally, pleased to introduce Peter Van Tine. He's the managing partner with Bessenyey and Van Tine, L.L.C. in Anchorage, Alaska, and advises conservation groups, Alaska Native tribes, local communities, and individuals on environmental issues. His practice includes federal and state court litigation, as well as advocacy in the federal and state governments. He has testified before Congress on issues related to Arctic oil and gas drilling. Peter is also co-author of a legal review and history of Arctic offshore oil and gas drilling. He previously worked as litigation director at Trustees for Alaska and as a trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice. Each of our panelists today will give a brief opening statement, and then we will engage in a dialogue. And everyone here will have this opportunity, as Dr. K pointed out, about submitting questions. So let me turn the microphone over to Jed, our first panelist.
Okay, thank you, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to speak to all you. I call this the case for Arctic oil and gas development, and it's 6 quick points. First, Arctic hydrocarbons are needed to meet future world energy demand. Due to rising population and access in third world countries or developing countries to affordable energy, the energy demand, the world energy demand is anticipated to grow by 35% by 2040, and Arctic resources, which take decades to develop, will be needed to help that future demand. Second, Arctic exploration is not new, and we frequently see Arctic exploration discussed in the media as though it's new to the industry and something that's just come about because diminished ice cover has made the areas accessible. Well, in actuality, there are over 400 discoveries that have been made north of the Arctic Circle, and over 117 billion oil equivalent barrels have been produced north of the Arctic Circle. And when you look at offshore, there have been 440 offshore wells drilled north of the Arctic Circle. Third, new technology is now available to protect the Arctic marine environment from oil spills. Generally, the number one concern of stakeholders when you talk about development of the Arctic is oil spills. Recent developments post-Macondo of emergency shut-off devices, well shut-off devices, capping stacks as they're known, coupled with 2 decades and tens of millions of dollars of research by industry in Arctic oil spill response, have given us the ability to both prevent and respond to spills in ice. Fourth point is the majority of the Arctic oil potential lies offshore Russia and the US and is developable using existing technology. Only the US and Russian shelves in the Arctic are broad and have significant amount of the area in a water depth less than 100 meters, which is amenable to conventional technology. And I'm talking about bottom-founded structures such as the ones that are currently in use off Sakhalin Island or in the Pechora Sea. The fifth point is oil development is important to the North Slope communities, the state of Alaska, and to the nation. Alaska's North Slope boroughs receive about $180 million a year in revenue from taxes on oil and gas infrastructure. 1/3 of Alaskan jobs, as well as 1/3 of the Alaskan economy derives from the oil and gas business, and 90% of state revenue comes from oil and gas. Nationally, Arctic oil can support U.S. energy security as conventional oil production declines in the future. And then the final point is that other nations will develop their Arctic resources. Russia holds the lion's share of the Arctic coast and shelf, about 45% of the total area, the US about 11%. And it would be naive to think that the Russians will not develop their sovereign resources because they are a true Arctic nation with over 40 icebreakers. Likewise, Norway, Greenland, Canada are all pursuing exploration for Arctic oil and gas. Hence, in many respects, a debate over whether there should be Arctic development is really, in the US, is moot. So given this reality, the U.S. must consider its national security, its energy security, and the technology implications of doing nothing while others proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jed. Greatly appreciate that. Our next panelist is Kevin Harun. So, Kevin.
Thank you, Rich. This summer was my 43rd anniversary of arriving in Alaska, and I give you a perspective of somebody who's lived there. I came to Alaska when there was hardly any oil there. It was just a speck in the state budget, and studied petroleum engineering and mining at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, along with Yupik Eskimo language as well. And so what I tell you is heartfelt. Alaska and the Arctic is unique. I mean, it's relatively pristine. It's one of the last untapped wilderness areas on Earth. And it's a very special place. Flying across Alaska, if you haven't been there, if you can imagine flying up the East Coast in about 1620 and what you would see, that's what you'll see when you fly over most of the Arctic. People live there. It's home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. I once had a job flying into 20 Eskimo villages in Alaska, and the job was to knock on every fifth house and ask people if I could look in their refrigerators for a cost of living survey. Do you know what I found? Ketchup and mustard, and outside hanging up on nails were the walrus meat and what people lived off of. And that was seal, fish, polar bear. The Arctic is also extreme. Rich mentioned hurricanes. I mean, did you know there were hurricanes in the Arctic? And that's one big problem there. The Arctic is not Las Vegas. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And that's a really big point, because climate change impacts are happening twice as fast there and are impacting weather patterns throughout the world. I remember when I was younger and we talked about the Amazon was not considered to be very big in terms of environmental issues at that time. And it was described as the lungs of the planet. Well, think of the Arctic as the circulatory system of the planet that affects all sorts of weather patterns. A new ocean is opening up, as you know, big changes. Fish stocks are moving north, polar bears and walruses are losing ice habitat. Villagers are under stress. In the village of St. Lawrence Island, they had to bring in meat because the people didn't have enough meat because they couldn't actually hunt for the walrus because of the lack of ice. There's vicious feedback loops that are happening right now with ice reflects normally heat back in the atmosphere. As it melts, it absorbs more. The same kind of vicious feedback loop occurs with permafrost, with methane. Based on the information that I've just given you, I have a couple really key questions. You're going to hear that technology is the answer. Better rigs, better blowout technology. But there is an inherent unsafe situation in the Arctic with the mixture of oil and water. I'll get into that later with the questions, but this is not the Gulf Coast. Things do not deteriorate, degrade as rapidly. It's cold water. And I will tell you why it could cause an ecosystem collapse because of the relationship of predator and prey species. What are the impacts, the second question, is of unleashing all this carbon in the Arctic on climate change? I mean, basically, this is the University of Houston. Many of you here are the new future leaders in our energy sector, and I would challenge you to call for a new generation of leadership that looks at renewables, that actually leads not just anything that you're taught, but actually moves forward to provide you in this room. I know there are some of you that will impact public policy for the future. Many of you have kids or plan on having kids. What kind of world are we going to have? Now, I'm an optimistic person, and I just want to say the biggest problem with all this change is the rate of change over time. I mean, if you look at mass extinctions or you look at some of the big problems that have faced the world over, time immemorial, it's because species could not adapt quickly enough. That's why the Arctic calls for planning, for a pause, to make sure that what we're doing is right. I, tonight, will also unveil a 5-point plan for you, how we can do that optimistically. And so thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your being here.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Our third panelist is Bob Reiss. Bob?
Listening to you, can you hear me? Yeah. Listening, I'm reminded when I was in college and SDS tried to take over a building. That was a radical organization in the 70s, and I was with some people who tried to stop them. We didn't like the Vietnam War, but we didn't like taking over buildings. And the SDS guy yelled at me, "The guy in the middle always dies first." So tonight, I'm the guy in the middle still, I think. On the day that I started my book, The Eskimo and the Oil Man, the Deepwater Horizon was in flames. We all remember the images, and we know how terrible that it was. And on that day, I was at the top of Alaska in the office of the mayor of the North Slope. The North Slope is a county the size of Wyoming, and the mayor is the chief executive. And he was meeting with the head of Shell Oil, Marvin Odom, that day. And I was there for a magazine parade. Marvin walked in, and those guys went at it. Now, my background at that point was as an environmental writer. I'd written a book about the Amazon, the lungs of the planet. I'd written a book about global warming, and certainly believed that it's caused by human beings. The last thing I expected on that day, as I started writing a book about oil in the Arctic, was that I might, in any way, shape, or form, in the end, even after being objective, come out in any way supporting limited exploratory drilling. But a year later, when that mayor was in tears because Shell couldn't drill, I found that I had changed my mind, and I was supporting limited a big word, exploratory drilling. Exploratory means you're just looking for it, you're not allowed to produce it. During that year of research and traveling around the world and talking to people in Washington, the Navy, the Pentagon, I took my lead from the Inupiat people, certainly part of the environment up there, and especially the whalers, the last people who I thought would be on that side, from William Riley at the Deepwater Horizon Commission, and from the Coast Guard, and also from a sense of disgust they had at the way the federal government had treated Shell Oil. I'm not a big fan of oil companies. I'm probably not even a little fan of oil companies, but you know, we're Americans and we pride ourselves on fairness, and I really was disgusted at the way they were treated. So tonight, as we talk, I will be in the middle. I'll also have some suggestions about how industry might adapt in the Arctic and how government should adapt in the Arctic. And then, being the guy in the middle, well, I told you what will happen. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Bob. Our final panelist is Peter Van Tine. Peter?
Thank you, Rich. 5 days ago in Akiak, Alaska, Native leader and Iditarod musher Mike Williams, Sr., someone that both Kevin and I know, stepped out of his home to see his dog lot falling into the Kuskokwim River, pulling 7 of his dogs with it.
Microphone's not working.
Maybe closer.
Red light on?
Red light is on.
Then speak.
Speak. That's me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. 5 days ago in Akiak, Alaska, Native leader and Iditarod musher Mike Williams, Sr., someone that both Kevin and I know, stepped out of his home to see his dog lot falling into the Kuskokwim River, pulling 7 of his dogs with it. Hanging from their chains, the dogs were saved by quick action from people in the village. Called a mass erosion event, scientists say this can happen when permafrost, the layer of frozen earth and ice that underlays much of the Arctic, melts. Add to that some rain, and the river's current, and the land is torn asunder. We know that human activity is changing the climate. That is beyond dispute. We can have a legitimate debate about how we are going to address this problem. We cannot deny the science. We also know that the devastating consequences if the current trend lines continue. We know there's not going to be a nation on this earth that's not impacted negatively. People will suffer. Economies will suffer. Entire nations will find themselves under severe stress. More drought, more floods, rising sea levels, greater migration, more refugees, more scarcity, more conflict. Those are not my words. Rather, they're the words of President Obama that I heard a few weeks ago in Anchorage. So what is he doing about it? Nearly everything he can. A global climate action plan, engaging on that with the Pope and many countries around the world. A national clean power plan, large investments in alternative energy, all have made progress. And as he himself admits, far more progress is necessary if we are to avoid the worst effects of this changing climate. The president also recognizes that he is hemmed in from doing more by politics, which requires compromise. Thus, we travel a circuitous route to where we know we must land. And so here we are today, talking about an activity, oil and gas drilling in America's Arctic waters, approved by the Obama administration, that not only would exacerbate the problem of climate change, but is only possible due to the melting of sea ice due to climate change. Does President Obama not see the irony, the conflict in this situation? Of course he does. He understands it well. He was backed into Arctic drilling by an administration that approved it through a process that it did not address the big picture questions that mark rational planning and decision making. Unlike with commercial fishing in Arctic waters, where we in the United States chose to close commercial fishing there due to the rapidly changing nature of that environment, we drive blindly ahead and intentionally so toward Arctic drilling. But does that mean that Arctic drilling is a done deal? Absolutely not. Let's look at what's happening. The market itself suggests that this is too reckless an endeavor. Insurers like Lloyd's, warning of, quote, unique and hard to manage risk, urge oil companies to step back from Arctic drilling. Around the world, companies are delaying or abandoning their Arctic drilling plans. For example, Statoil and ConocoPhillips, the other two large oil companies that bought leases in America's Arctic waters, make no move to explore those leases. Due to a falling out with other oil companies about its Arctic drilling program, Shell was forced out this month of the Prince of Wales climate change project, which it helped found. And with respect to Shell, 8 years, $7 billion into its drilling efforts, what does it have to show for its Arctic exploration? One well in one sea that it reaches deep enough to look for oil. And those seas ahead are rough. Logistical and operational challenges plague its operations. It's got significant legal hurdles to 2016 activity. Low oil prices threaten its projects. The public is coming to a better understanding of the unique and sensitive Arctic environment, and thus what is at stake if it's drilled. An effort to lift oil exports. For decades, and we heard this tonight, people have said that national security demands that we drill more at home to become energy independent. And now that we, remarkably, are energy independent, we immediately talk about what? Exporting oil? We're risking the Arctic for what? Asks the public. Unprecedented growth in renewable energy, despite huge subsidies, about $21 billion annually to the oil and gas industry. And we have a growing economy to boot. And finally, an even greater understanding of the negative effect Arctic oil would have on the climate. So no, Shell is a long way from home on this one, both physically and in terms of being assured that it can keep going with its Arctic drilling plans. And it's a good thing too, because climate change aside, we're a long way from safe drilling in Arctic waters. One sees this in Shell's myriad troubles, and also in the fact that oil spill response technology has not meaningfully improved for decades. The same technology used to recover oil from Santa Barbara beaches in 1969 was used on Santa Barbara beaches in 2015. Shovels and buckets. Take those pictures of a desperate and huge effort to clean the oil gulf and transfer them to America's Arctic, where there is not one deepwater port, not one connected road, where there are very few airports, where there is no fishing fleet for vessels of opportunity to help out, where the nearest Coast Guard base is over 1,000 miles away, where darkness, storms, and ice combine to make travel difficult for substantial portions of the year. This is all not to say that the Arctic should not or will not see development. Of course it will. We are already seeing it with the massive increase in ships traversing the Beaufort, Chukchi, and Bering Seas. 2 weeks ago, I was in Nome and saw a huge cruise ship moored offshore. Didn't have a port it could dock at, or a dock that it could tie up at. And it had just come across the top of North America from Nuuk, Greenland. Its passengers spoke of the marvels that they saw on their trip. They followed a pod of that mythical narwhal. They saw elusive minke whales. They observed up close, think about this from the polar bear perspective, a mother polar bear and cubs as this 4-story high cruise ship came up to it. That ship was headed back the way it came with a new load of passengers. And you can be sure that when those people speak of their experiences, more ships will follow. Ports and infrastructure will thus also follow. But oil and gas drilling, of course it's risky business. Too risky, in fact. And given the rough seas between here and actual delivery of such oil to market, I am of the opinion that it will not happen. Thank you, Rich.
Well, thank you, Peter. Well, I believe that everybody would agree that based on these opening remarks, that there is much that needs to be discussed as we discern the issues concerning the development of the Arctic. So let me begin with a question for Jed. Jed, you mentioned about the future demand, but given the recent growth of U.S. unconventional oil production, well, why should we be exploring for new sources of oil in the Arctic?
Okay, thank you, Rich. Yes, there is a flood of production from unconventional sources in the U.S. now, thanks to advances in technology. The difference between those kinds of wells and what I would call a traditional conventional oil well is that a conventional well depletes at about 6% per year when it goes on decline. These wells deplete much more quickly at 20, 30% a year. So you would anticipate, and studies that we looked at for the National Petroleum Council studies show that the unconventionals will start to decline. And it's unlikely that there would be any Arctic production from the Arctic until 2030. As a matter of fact, Van Buren, Shell's CEO, just recently said even if they make a major find in the Chukchi, they will not probably produce until 2030. And so it's anticipated that for the U.S., that Arctic stream could come on as conventionals were declining and help maintain U.S. energy independence and security. And that's why I say that exploring for Arctic oil now is needed so that you can bring it on to production by the 2030 timeframe.
Well, thank you, Bob. Now, Jed, now, Bob, you spent several years with the indigenous people up on the North Slope. And can you comment about the attitude that these local people would have towards this offshore drilling and production?
I feel bad for the Inupiat communities. I think of all the communities in the United States that face the question of development versus saving environment, they probably have it the roughest. The North Slope was formed as a political entity by the Inupiat people when oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on land. So now we've got oil and it's just on land. And the reason that they created this county was so they could tax oil. Any Inupiat elder, anyone over 65 years old there, went to Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. They had no running water. They had no plumbing. There certainly weren't any high schools. There was no infrastructure. They chopped ice for drinking water, and they burned whale blubber for heat. That changed when the borough began taxing oil infrastructure. And so now there are old folks' homes. They have all the amenities that you have in Houston, and they want to keep them. So when we talk about the environment, do the indigenous people, are they part of the environment? Do they constitute the environment? Do we pay attention to their needs? So when it comes to their attitude toward offshore oil, they are really scared about it, as everybody on the table here knows. But they're also scared of losing those amenities, and they're torn. Now, given a choice, many of them would want to open up Anwar, which is protected by Congress, and drill on land. Well, you can't do that. And the Alaska land-based oil has dried up. The pipeline's running 1/3 full. So of all the Eskimo power structure's got three major components. And the one I paid the most attention to is the whaling captains. The Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission sounds bureaucratic. It's the men in these villages who are responsible for the food that we were talking about, the lives of their crews, their cousins, their uncles, their neighbors, the people they grew up with, and they have no interest in destroying, their food source, the whales. When they dropped the opposition to the legal suits, because they feel this conflict so much, that was what convinced me. So it's something that families disagree on, people disagree on, but the bulk of the people I know want limited exploratory drilling.
All right, well, thank you.
Rich, do you mind if I...
Sure, Peter. I want you to expand on that anyways, because, the indigenous people, they occupy a very unique niche with the whole climate justice movement. Their subsistence lifestyle can be severely disrupted by the effects of climate change. Domestic law is often applied differently to those indigenous people than to the non-indigenous peers. So please, go ahead.
Thank you. I noticed this was earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, that Edward Itta, who's in Bob's book, was speaking to a reporter and had this to say. Their spin, and it's always been a spin, is that we had enough safety controls to make sure it doesn't happen. All well and good. Didn't I hear that before somewhere? Exxon Valdez, Horizon spill. Accidents will happen. There's no spill technology in the world that can take care of a spill up here in the Arctic, period. I think the United States of America should suck all the oil dry first on land before you go offshore. Less risky, right? As Bob said, that's the preference for them and for a lot of people. Recognize as well that this is not a crisis situation for the North Slope Borough. They made a very astute deal when they started getting oil money, and that was they taxed the infrastructure on which the oil industry is built there. So as long as that infrastructure is operational, and this has been litigated over and over again in our state courts, most recently saying that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline will be operational for another 30 years minimum, we're seeing that price of taxes that are paid to the North Slope Borough will stay steady for quite a long time. And all of us in this country at one point or another, either our generation, our kids' generation, or hopefully not their kids' generation, are going to have to move beyond oil. And I say that those of us who are in the position today of knowing the consequences of not doing that should bear the responsibility of getting us started in that direction. Thank you, Rich.
All right, thank you, Peter. I'm going to go to Kevin first, and then I'll come back to you, Bob. So, Kevin?
Well, I just wanted to address something you said, Bob, from the get-go, and I say this respectfully and thoughtfully, but really, I don't think there's any middle or left here tonight, and I think one of the things that we have a problem with in our country is labeling things and saying, and then that's an easy way to dismiss someone. And I think you have some pro-oil views, and I have some pro-oil views, believe it or not, too, in some respects. For example, like I support natural gas development in Alaska. I think it's a great transition fuel. We need a transition fuel to renewables. With regard to Alaska natives, I can attest, I was in Barrow before they had any amenities, when they had honey buckets. I saw it personally. I know how important it is to keep those amenities. But it's not, the native view is not one monolith. In fact, in many places, if you speak up, your whole family will lose their jobs in some of these small communities. And so it's a real tough issue. With regard to the Arctic Refuge, of course the Inupiat are for development because they don't have any of the impacts there. It's the Athabascan Indians who live off the caribou, who depend on it and who know that area better, who are opposed to it. So I think we need a more balanced look at this because it's not black and white and it's not as polarizing as we would think.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Bob?
I'm glad you brought that up about the two extremes in the middle. I agree with you totally about the way the country's going in terms of extremes, big time. Just point of fact on Edward, I spoke to him about 3 weeks ago and asked him in the years since I started working on the book, had he changed his fundamental opinion? And everything you say about his caveats is absolutely true. But when we came to the bottom line, he had not changed that fundamental support of the limited exploratory drilling.
Thank you. Now, Jed, Peter mentioned about these new emergency well shut-off devices and all. Could you elaborate some more about that and how they reduce the risk of an offshore blowout?
Yeah, Rich. Oops. Post-Macondo, the industry stepped back and said, well, we have the technology to make standardized devices that you could install on a well where you had loss of control and the BOP had failed. It's in Macondo. And took it upon themselves to design and test and build a series of these, which are now positioned around the world, ready to be used in deep water applications. And they're basically an independent blowout preventer, independent in that it's independently actuated from the rig's normal blowout preventer. They're an emergency stack that can be placed on top, shut off the flow in a matter of hours or days versus the month or so it might take to drill a relief well. There are other devices. ExxonMobil used one for a successful well we drilled last year in conjunction with Rosneft in the Kara Sea, and that is called a subsea isolation device. That's basically a pre-installed capping stack. So if there's an issue with loss of control of the well or something goes wrong with the blowout preventer, then these rams can be thrown that shear off the pipe and seal off the well. thus preventing flow in a matter of minutes. And we felt that's necessary in an Arctic application where you really don't want to spill oil. So those technologies were in response to Macondo, and there's a 74-page API standard on how to design, build, test, and use these things, and it's becoming a routine part of drilling in offshore areas.
Well, having personally witnessed continuous improvement over 40 years in the oil and gas industry, I know that you were the lead author, Jed, on the technology chapters for the recent National Petroleum Council report on the research needs to support prudent U.S. Arctic development. Could you discuss a couple of the top research recommendations that come out of that study?
Yes. For the audience, the National Petroleum Council was requested by the Secretary of Energy, Moniz, to respond to a question, which is what research is needed to facilitate prudent development of the U.S. Arctic oil and gas, and prudent having multiple dimensions, including protection of the environment, energy security, economics, the full slate of things that need to be considered when you're trying to balance these difficult risk-based decisions. Now, what we saw when we looked at the U.S. Arctic, all shallow water, amenable to conventional proven technology, was that no technology advance was going to make a sea change difference. In other words, that is already developable. So we turned our attention on the main things, and that is development of public trust and informing the public. Likewise, development of the trust of the stakeholders, because we visited with the North Slope community people during the study, and we learned that they do have this conflicted position of being a combined cache and sustenance hunting, and they need both of them. So our research recommendations centered around field demonstrations of oil spill response technologies that have been developed by the industry for Arctic waters over the last 2 decades to try to get more of the public and stakeholders informed about that. Other research concerned, we know if we have a year-round structure offshore that you will have to break ice. You have to bring vessels in and out of there. And it was looking at the potential impacts of that year-round ice breaking on ice-dependent species. It was something we thought we need to understand and demonstrate prior to going out there and trying to put in a development platform. And so you saw the research needs rising to the top that were more focused on addressing the real hurdles to Arctic development.
Well, thank you. Now, Peter, yeah, I was going to ask you, you surely know some of the public concerns about that report. Could you care to comment?
I do. I'll make a few points. One is loss of well control incidents have remained at the same level pre-Macondo as they were pre-Macondo since Macondo. And that's based on the government regulator that is the head regulator for the Gulf of Mexico. It just hasn't developed to the point where that's meaningful yet, at least in my opinion. And look, I was on one of the latest spill drills in the Beaufort Sea in 1999, and they had one in 2000. Those are the last ones that I know. We don't do spill drills, actual spill drills in Arctic conditions. They've done some of them offshore of Seattle in calm, temperate waters. When I was there in the Beaufort Sea in the summer on an ice-breaking barge pulled by 2 tugs, it was a spectacular failure. Spectacular. It was a glorified mop that was hung over the side on a crane that was put into the water, spun around on its axis, picked up, brought onto the board, put into the hold, and then a squeegee would come, close it, and they'd pull it out. And pretty simple. It's like your kitchen mop and bucket from the 1950s. And yet it didn't work because the strands kept getting caught up. And that was the best technology in 1999. The head of the state DNR at the time was very, very upset. He said 2 things. He goes, number 1, I can't believe BP failed that badly. It was a BP contractor that did that. And number two, I am furious that they allowed the public to be there to see that. And that is what we're dealing with. The mop and the bucket and shovels are, look at the pictures, folks, 2015 Santa Barbara. We do our best, but nevertheless, that technology is nascent and has not changed in decades, at least on when oil hits that shore. And let's talk about the National Petroleum Council report, because it assumes that the conditions will remain business as usual from now till 2030, that we need that oil. And unfortunately, what the scientists tell us is that if that's the case, we're going to see warming of at least 6 degrees. At least 6 degrees. What does that mean for asthma attacks, respiratory disease, degraded air quality? It means much worse human health. It also means more frequent, destructive, and deadly weather events. So we can't go with a business as usual approach. Thank you, Rich.
Kevin?
Well, even if you dismiss the climate change impacts of actually removing that carbon from the Arctic, I do agree with you, Jed, that technology is improving. In 30 years, it'll be even better. And there is no harm in moving slower here in terms of leaving the oil in the ground. It'll still be there. Now, I have to say that Shell's efforts in Alaska do not really inspire confidence if you're watching them very closely. I mean, if you look at the last drilling season before what happened, the almost disaster that happened then even this year, the icebreaker had a big hole in it that had to be repaired. And I have a fisherman friend in Alaska, and I said, what do you think about this? And he said, well, and he fishes down in that same area. He said, well, look, all of our little boats have equipment that can tell when we're coming close to grounding. Why didn't that icebreaker have equipment that could tell whether it's grounding? It just didn't make sense. I have to also say that the oil industry does not, as a whole, inspire confidence when it comes to climate change. Because 20, 30 years ago, they knew of the impacts. They knew of the coming changes. And what did they do? They hired, paid people to go out there and discredit the whole issue. And that's why we're in the mess we're in today, is because we did not tackle that issue earlier. And it's almost at the point where I have to ask the question, sometimes people think, well, I wonder, have they given up on the issue of climate change? Because is it that far gone that we can't do anything about it? Is that so we can just get ours now in the next 30 to 50 years or 20 years of our own lifetime and make our profit? I think we need to work together on this. The oil industry has the expertise, but frankly, I just don't trust some of the motivations sometimes because of, particularly on that issue of climate change. That's a big issue, just misinformation. And so I have to really look carefully and thoughtfully at what I'm hearing when it comes to promises. And the biggest problem, as the Arctic Council has said, is a heavy fuel oil spill in the Arctic. And the reason this is important, and this is very important, it's probably one of the most important things I'm going to tell you tonight. In the Arctic, there are few predator and prey species. One predator may rely on 1 or 2 prey species. It's not like the Gulf. If you wipe out one of those prey species, you can cause an ecosystem collapse throughout the whole Arctic. That's something that's a possibility there because of the ecosystem, because of the fact that oil can be covered under ice, over ice. This calls for caution, a precautionary approach, to make sure that we don't move forward until we're absolutely secure. There's other sources of oil, there's other transitional fuels. That's what we need to be going for first before we look at the Arctic.
Now, I want Bob to chime in here. There's 5,000 indigenous people at least up there. Somehow they have to be involved in the process.
Before we go to the indigenous people, can I go to the oil spill for a second?
Sure, Bob.
I completely agree with you guys about the oil spills. Nobody knows whether or not you can clean up oil. And the interesting thing, or the maddening thing about this over years is nobody knows, people fight about it, and then the government sells leases. Nobody knows, and then there's a legal case. Nobody knows, and then there are hearings. This goes on year after year after year. So when was that test? It was 1999. 1999. Now here's the thing about the oil spill test, because the no-brainer is have a test, right? Government doesn't allow a test. So one of the suggestions that I have, and I think that this is a major, major suggestion, I would really like to see the environmental groups and the oil companies get together and demand a test. Demand big tests. Can you clean up oil under ice? And let's use those answers to inform national policy.
Can I address the oil spill? Yes, Bob, you are correct, and that's one of the primary recommendations to NPC study is that there are field demonstration tests done with oil in the U.S. Arctic, which you cannot do right now. The industry has done tests recently, far more recently than what you talked about, of applications of dispersant in situ burning of crude oil spilled intentionally offshore Norway, because Norway allows that in the interest of progressing technology. But Peter, what you saw was a demonstration of mechanical cleanup. And everyone recognizes that for most oil spills, which are very small, mechanical cleanup, you can actually remove the oil. But if you have a large spill, you're not going to get in there if it's open water or ice and mechanically remove that oil. I mean, after Macondo, a very small fraction of it was actually picked up by booms and skimmers. So the technology approach that has evolved is the application of dispersants, and a significant study on the efficacy of dispersants in a cold water environment has been demonstrated. And not only that, the naturally occurring hydrocarbon biodegrading bacteria exist in the Arctic. A number of tests done where they took water from the Beaufort Sea, -2 degrees C, put dispersed oil in there, closed it up, kept it in a refrigerator, and that oil biodegraded at nearly the rates that you see in the Gulf of Mexico. Those bacteria are ubiquitous because natural seepage occurs in the oceans. If there were not naturally accommodating bacteria, there wouldn't be a sandy beach in the world. It'd all be asphalt, because about 14 million barrels of oil a year are leaked by natural seepage into the oceans. In the Gulf of Mexico, 980,000 barrels a year of natural seepage. That's about 1/5 of Macondo spill. So the bacteria system has evolved to take these hydrocarbons, which are naturally occurring in the environment, and degrade it. The other mechanism is in situ burning. That is by far the most effective approach. And the advances that have been made are the application of soaps as chemical herders that can herd the oil to a thickness where you can combust large fractions of it, say 90% of the oil. And ice actually helps for in situ combustion over open water, because in open water, the oil quickly spreads to a thickness it won't ignite, less than 2 millimeters. The ice helps keep the oil thick so it can be burned. And those are the more effective approaches for any spill of consequence in the Arctic.
Laboratories are not realistic places to do this in the Arctic. You do not introduce a toxin to deal with oil in the environment. You just should not do that. It's cold water. I don't even think it worked well in the Gulf. Do we know that yet? Those studies are being done. It sure doesn't look good. And look, we're talking about 2012. I don't even need to put oil in the water to do the test, Bob. I'd like to see them put the boats in the water that have the skimmers with them. They didn't even do that in 2012. Not a boat went into the water. The smaller boats that they have on their barges and on shore there, they didn't even put them in the water. What I heard from some of the people that worked is they were too scared. The weather was too rough. They're small boats. That's big water.
There's no such thing as spill response, really. It's all prevention. That's the only way to solve the problem. And I have to say, I was again there at the Exxon Valdez, and after that happened, guess what happened? They came in with dispersants, and many folks that have looked at that said that had more of an environmental detriment than the spill itself. And guess who sold the dispersants? It was Exxon, and they made more money off of the dispersants. So I just have to say, we have to look behind the scenes. What's the rationale for some of this? Because prevention is where it's at. We can stop these catastrophes if we prevent. We can't clean it up.
Actually, the application of dispersants after the Valdez spill was denied by the Coast Guard, and they were not applied. They may have been applied to the beach, but they were not applied to the spilled oil on the ocean surface where they could have been effective.
On the beaches
and I think
they
that was a
were.
learning that was a huge mistake. It need pre-approvals of dispersant application. It's important to do it quickly, as in the Macondo well, where they actually applied a dispersant at the flowing wellhead.
By the way, the federal government has estimated that there is a 75% chance of one or more large oil spills from the Chukchi leases that Shell holds during the life of those leases.
Now, I see that we've been joined by Jennifer Delohe from the Houston Chronicle. She's got some questions. But before we get there, Jennifer, I got one more topic I want to introduce here. And we mentioned, of course, that Shell's up there drilling an exploratory well. Even if they found something, it's going to be another 15, 20 years or so before production happens. But during that whole time period, the Northwest Passage will open up for shipping on there. And Kevin, I'd like to get your comments about the Polar Code, just adopted by the International Maritime Organization. It goes into effect January 1st, 2017. Pacific Environment, your organization, played a major role in writing it. So what protections does that Polar Code provide for the Arctic development, and are these protections sufficient?
The Polar Code is a big advance. It's the United Nations' first attempt to set rules for Arctic development, particularly as it applies to maritime law. Probably the major thing we had a hand in on the safety side, it's divided into a safety and an environmental portion, is on the safety side that all mariners, when they plot their routes through the Arctic, are now required to look at all available data of marine mammals and avoid those areas before they move through the Arctic. That's a big advance on the safety side. On the environmental side, there's a complete ban on the discharge of oil in oily waters. That might sound like that's logical anyway, but in parts of the world you can, for example, with machinery, you have contact with oil, and that is typically disposed of into open water. That cannot be done in the Arctic, as well as strong restrictions on garbage. The issue that they really missed is probably the biggest issue I mentioned about heavy fuel oil spill. A lot of ships operate on heavy fuel oil, which is thick, viscous. What we really need to do is make sure that ships in the Arctic operate on distillate fuel. Some ships even have the ability to switch between heavy fuel oil and distillate, because distillate fuel would largely evaporate and would not persist in the environment like heavy fuel oil would. And crude oil, of course, is a heavy fuel oil too. So that would be the biggest advance. It's the thing that they missed. We're going to be going back to the United Nations body this coming January to attempt to look at that issue again. There's also the issue of carriage of heavy fuel, because a lot of these small communities depend on heavy fuel oil for their heating, electricity. And so that is another impetus for renewables in these villages, and not just in Alaska, but also Russia and Canada. Very, very similar places in many ways.
Well, thank you. Bob, please.
Sorry, just quick for a sec. There's been an assumption so far that I think I should correct, and it's that if Shell finds oil with this exploratory drilling, that automatically means that in 20 years they'll be able to get it out. The truth is that this whole effort this year is to see whether it's there. If it's there, then they go through an entire 10-year process to get the permissions from the federal government to prove that they can do it, to prove that the pipelines would be safe, to prove that the platforms would be safe. And a couple of years ago, I asked the then head of the Coast Guard in Alaska whether he was comfortable with Shell's exploratory drilling plan, and he said completely. And I said, what about production? And he said, well, they'd need a game changer. But that's capitalism, right? I mean, the company gets the lease, they're willing to risk whether or not they find the oil, then it's their risk whether or not they can prove to the appropriate parties that the infrastructure would work. So it's not a lock, even if they find oil, that they'll pull it out.
Thank you. Jennifer, first question.
Well, several audience members had a question following right on what Bob just had to say, talking about the technological challenges of bringing any oil find to market. So this is a question for several of you. What are some of the technological challenges of production in the Arctic? What kind of new technologies will need to be developed to reach and extract oil in this harsh environment? And how do you design production facilities and pipelines that manage around ice gouging and scour? I mean, is it even possible?
I just want to say very briefly that Shell is not really drilling for oil, they're drilling for assets. I mean, they're in trouble. And this is a gamble because if they find recoverable oil, they can put that oil as assets on their books. So I'm not really even sure they want to produce at this point, but I do think that's the reason they're there. And so I don't know whether it's going to happen at all.
Well, Jen, let's get into the technical details that Jennifer just asked about. You've then looked at ice gouging on pipelines and other items like that.
That's true. And remember I said that for the U.S. shelf and the Russian shelf, they're shallow, and conventional technology applies. You can protect pipelines from ice gouge by burying them, and both Shell and ExxonMobil have done that offshore Sakhalin Island, where there are significant ice gouging every year. So do there need, I mean, that got down to Eunice's question, is there technology gaps that need to be filled in order to develop the Arctic? Well, if you're going to deep water Arctic, where a bottom-founded structure won't work, yes. We don't know how to drill production wells year-round, and therefore we couldn't economically develop something in deep water with the current state of technology. But when you're talking about all this shallow water stuff, it's absolutely amenable to existing technologies, and it has been applied and operated for decades.
My view on that is one technological challenge is they explore for oil when the ice is not present. To the extent that the ice will be present, it still comes in seasonally to the Arctic when it's dark, when the storms are there, when people don't travel on those waters. Are you going to be able to produce oil in those environments? That Shell moved off of its well site in 2012 for, I think it was 2 weeks, when a Manhattan-sized ice flow headed their way. That said, and it's true what Bob said about the hurdles between exploring and finding oil and developing it, you see the momentum that gets built toward development, and certainly there'll be a lot of debates and challenges between here and development, but I will say that when a company invests $7 billion to date in an exploration well, for the federal government to come back later on and say, you know what, we're going to err, you might be right, we're not sure that you're right, but we're going to err on the side of letting you go ahead because you've invested 12, 13 billion, so we're just going to go ahead and do that. That's realistically what often happens with our government, and that's not a level playing field. So we have to be careful not to let that tilt influence those final decisions.
Jennifer, how about another question?
So oil prices are clearly on the audience members' minds tonight. A half dozen people have all asked essentially the same question. They want to know just what kind of crude price will be needed to make Arctic oil economic. And specifically, they're curious how much recoverable oil and gas would have to be present in a field like Shell's Chukchi C prospect, the Burger prospect, to make the venture worth the high risks and the financial costs.
Very good question. And do we have any expertise or comments concerning all of that?
Well, I'm an engineer and I deal with the technical side, so I'm not an oil economist. But I do know that our developments offshore Sakhalin Island, which are in an ice environment, the perfect first step towards an Arctic, true Arctic application, are some of the most profitable fields we have. So at the current, or last year's current oil prices, certainly so. And it depends on where it is and how difficult it is. I mean, things change all the way across the Arctic. There's not one Arctic. Where we drilled in the Kara Sea, that is a first-year ice environment only. The next logical step from offshore Sakhalin, the cost of developing that would be much less than moving further, say, into the Beaufort. So it depends.
Kevin?
Yeah, Jed, I wanted to address Sakhalin because my organization, Pacific Environment, was really instrumental in that whole project because we work in Russia. And what happened there was that the industry was going to be doing drilling and running pipelines through the breeding grounds of the Western gray whale. And Pacific Environment stepped in, and actually we went to the banks and convinced the banks that if they allow this to go forward with funding, that they will be liable. Well, the banks pulled the funding. Okay? But that's not where we left it. We worked with the Russian government and the industry to come up with a plan whereby every year there's a panel of scientists that come together and figure out what's the best way to site pipelines and that development. That's kind of a model of good development, I think, where you actually bring in independent voices that can look at what the industry's doing and recommend a course of action. I think that's one reason why that Sakhalin project has also been more profitable too. And it's also, in terms of environmental opposition, I think it's calmed that down tremendously because of the good positive changes that have been made in citing those pipelines and developments.
Bob, what about the indigenous people? Where do they go in this process?
Where do they fit in the process
of the whole development of the Arctic? You know, we look at pipelines coming in on shore someplace.
Well, it's likely that that whole region could change in several ways. I was at an Arctic Symposium a couple of years ago, and there was an Inupiat woman there from one of the islands in the Bering Strait, and she said, every time I see a ship go by, I imagine there's someone from I feel like I'm caught in the binoculars of someone from Wall Street. So the development, there's no theory that brings the ice back. The development will proceed in the Arctic. And Vladimir Putin has said that he thinks that the Bering Strait is the next Suez Canal, and 18,000 ships went through the Suez Canal last year. And Peter was talking about the tourist ships going around. The biggest new diamond mines in the world are in the Canadian Arctic. The Russians have started buzzing us, Reiss started buzzing us since the Cold War off Alaska and also off Norway. The region is changing, and all these changes will affect the indigenous people. So I don't know if we can isolate oil from all these other changes. The world is changing pretty fast up there. They're resilient people. They're a strong people. They're confident people. I can only hope that whatever happens with the oil complements their way of life instead of destroying it.
The Bering Strait from Wales, Alaska to Little Diomede is 28 miles wide. In that area, the people of Wales, 350 people, hunt for walrus, seals, whales, migratory waterfowl, and fish. That's what feeds them. They go out in 18-foot aluminum boats with 40 horsepower kicker engines on them in the fog when the water is calm, because they have to go when the animals are there. They do not stay there, they migrate through there. Imagine that with the kind of vessel traffic that Bob's talking about. That's very real today, and it will be. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, that's the kind of development that guaranteed will happen. To add oil and gas with its risks on top of that makes no sense at all. And I don't think it's a necessary accompaniment to the kinds of development that the Arctic would otherwise see.
Well, related to all that is the Law of the Sea Treaty and the U.S. failure to ratify that. Maybe that doesn't affect oil at the moment, but it sure does in terms of territory, security, and influence. Bob, you want to make some comments about that?
The Law of the Sea Treaty is a treaty that's been on the table since the Reagan years. And under the treaty, any country that has oceanfront can claim up to 200 extra miles of sea bottom as an exclusive economic zone, 200 extra miles beyond what you now have. So for the United States, that's a potential gain of an area as much as twice the size of California off Alaska. Now, when you have an exclusive economic zone, you don't control the surface of the sea. That remains international. But you own what's underneath the sea. Every Arctic country has signed the Law of the Sea Treaty. The United States is the only Arctic country that hasn't signed it. And because we haven't signed it, we are out of the process now by which you can claim land, and we are out of the process by which the claims of other countries are analyzed. The way it works is, if you're a claimant country, you go to a committee in the United Nations. The committee is made up of scientists. The scientists analyze your claims, and your claim is based on, your claim is that your continental shelf goes all the way out for 400 miles. So the scientists say, yeah, it goes out or it doesn't, and then your claim is denied or accepted. Here's the problem. The same scientists who analyze the claims make the claims for their respective countries. And so when I went to the United Nations and talked to the head of the committee, and I asked him, he said, well, they don't analyze their own claims, so it's fair. And I said, well, what about horse trading in the cafeteria? I'll support your claim if you support my claim. And he said, yeah, that could happen. it is happening because Russia has now claimed an area the size of France and Spain combined, including the North Pole. If you have a mountain range that extends beyond your continental shelf, you can claim that too. So the Russian claims are being analyzed without United States participation. Now here's something else. Here are people who support this treaty in the US. Bush administration supported it, Obama administration supported it, Sierra Club supports it, oil companies support it, shipping companies support it, Pentagon supports it. You may be wondering, why haven't we signed it? And the reason is there's a small group of Republican senators in the Senate that have blocked it. They don't believe that the United States should be part of any international effort. And this is to our detriment. Coast Guard Admiral told me recently if the Law of the Sea Treaty was a ball game, the United States wouldn't be on the field, we wouldn't be in the stands, we wouldn't be in the stadium, we wouldn't be in the parking lot.
Next question, Jennifer.
We have a few climate questions tonight. I'll put them together for the sake of expediency. Specifically for Kevin, how will Arctic drilling itself affect the loss of ice in Alaska? And is there any kind of fear that drilling itself could somehow affect the ocean floor in a manner that could exacerbate erosion of the Alaska coastline? Finally, another questioner wants to know from Kevin and Peter, considering that climate change is a real and substantial problem, is it really appropriate to link any particular oil development to this broader problem?
Yeah, that latter question is a good one too, because I mean, as you know, we're increasing our use of fossil fuels, but that's not necessarily the future. It doesn't have to be that way. If you look at electricity generation in this country, I mean, 20 years ago they were projecting a demand curve that went sky high, and through efficiencies and through development of new technologies, that remained relatively flat. And I think the same thing can happen here. I don't think you can directly link Shell's particular development to a particular incident with climate change, but I do think if you look at the amount of carbon that would be hauled out through this drilling, if it does take place over time, that really should give us some pause as to whether this is the direction we should be going. Again, to take a more precautionary approach, to go slower. And then again, you know, I kind of look a little bit to Antarctica for what's happened there in terms of cooperation. It kind of fits in with the last question too, because Antarctica is very different because it doesn't have people living there. But there is a ban on heavy fuel oil. There is a commons, you know, it's to be used for scientific, for educational purposes in many cases. I think for the Arctic, we need to set up some territorial efforts that would create a commons. I think we need to slow down the rate of growth. I think we need to demilitarize the Arctic and make it so that you can't be sending military everywhere in the Arctic. We need to also create an adaptation fund for communities and marine mammals to be able to help communities and wildlife adapt. And then finally, create a governance structure for the Arctic that's stronger than the Arctic Council that can tackle some of these issues. I think there's a thoughtful way to look at it. And I'm not saying that oil development will never occur in the Arctic. I'm just saying, hey, we need to slow this down, take our time, do it right.
Now, when I look at hydrocarbon chains, you know, I would put wood, coal, oil, natural gas, decreasing the amount of carbons in there.
Yeah.
So as we move down that,
Yes.
we actually decrease the amount of carbon that is actually being burned and exposed. So any thoughts related to that about climate change and what the fuels that we use throughout the world?
Just say, you know, very briefly that natural gas is, again, a very good transitional fuel. And I think we need to be using more of that. And we're seeing that we're moving away from coal. And I think we'll see that transition away from oil more. And the oil is going to be real valuable down the road for other, you know, those of you involved in studying petrochemicals and other uses of oil, that oil is going to be very, very valuable for humanity's future someday. We shouldn't just be burning it.
I've heard 5 parts per million from Arctic oil development in terms of what it would do to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere. I don't know whether that's true or not. That's not my area of expertise. I can say that the argument that, well, you can't prove the causation from that oil to that specific climate change is a self-fulfilling prophecy that will lead us down the climate change hole for generations, because you can't say that about anything. So start somewhere. And then Jennifer, you had another question about the direct impacts of offshore oil and gas activity. I'll just give you one example that we're experiencing right now. Because of the lack of sea ice in the Arctic, the walrus come to shore at this time of year. Google walrus and Point Lay, L-A-Y, and you will see some remarkable pictures of 35,000 walrus hauled out on the beach near Point Lay, probably right now today. They are not only extremely vulnerable there to the impacts of an oil spill, as you can imagine, 35,000 walrus huddled together do not move quickly, but they have to go 70 miles offshore to their preferred feeding grounds at Hannah Shoal, which is also where Shell is drilling. It's one of the reasons Shell can only drill one well at a time out there. The sound imprint of these armada of vessels, Shell has 27 vessels, I think, as part of its drilling program, 2 drill rigs and all the support vessels, is absolutely massive. And so to try and understand those impacts is very difficult, very significant. And by the way, do we get any pictures of that? Do we get to see that? No, because the public can't easily witness it, which is a real concern. So some of those direct impacts, I believe, might be real, but I sure don't know because I haven't been there.
Jennifer, another question.
So an industry representative, echoing Jed Hamilton's comments earlier, notes that we've already produced more than 1 billion barrels of oil from the Beaufort Sea and another 1.3 billion barrels in Alaska's Cook Inlet. So given that history of offshore production in Alaska, including north of the Arctic Circle, aren't the concerns about Chukchi and Beaufort Sea drilling and development overblown? Is that relevant?
Boy, there's one offshore drilling island in the federal waters of the Beaufort Sea, and that's a BP development called North Star. It straddles state and federal waters at 3 miles. 5 of its bottom holes are in the state unit, and 2 of them are in the federal unit, if I'm correct. And that was on a tidally available island that they built up with riprap and operate on that island. That is not an offshore drill rig. And they have a pipeline that had, a lot of analysis for ice gouging. Their Cook Inlet, I see about 19 or so rigs from my home, and the flares of natural gas in the winter are highly evident. We've had problems in Cook Inlet as well, but I don't think they prove near the technological challenge of 70 miles offshore in the Chukchi Sea. It's just not the same. Although if you Googled North Star and looked at it on YouTube, you'd see a pretty amazing video of ice encroaching on that island that might raise the hair on the back of your neck.
About 4,000 kilometers of up to 2-meter thick ice pass by our Sakhalin platforms, which are well offshore, they're not islands, every year, and they do fine. And recently, the Russians installed the Presrazhnoye platform in the Pechora Sea, which operates year-round, including offloading to tankers in significant true Arctic ice. So I think those platforms demonstrate that it's quite possible to do what we're talking about.
All right. Bob, related to all that, you participated in some naval security war games in Rhode Island related to the whole opening up of the Arctic in general and the U.S. interests. What did you learn by doing that?
We've been talking about the North Slope of Alaska and its principal city, Barrow. On the 2 days when I witnessed the war games, I was surprised to be in a session where that's what they were looking at too, Barrow. So this small city that we're talking about up here was the focus of the U.S. Navy on that day. And I was in a classroom with submariners, Coast Guard people, Navy, technical people, Air Force, Marines, Army, you name it, and they're all looking at Barrow. And they're thinking, what could happen there? So the 4 scenarios that I will relate to you were not thought up by science fiction people or Hollywood. This was the Navy. What if terrorists are in the Northwest Passage and they seize a ship? Peter was talking about ships going through there. What if there's a ship with nukes out of North Korea north of Barrow? What if there's a massive oil spill? Was one of the scenarios. And the interesting thing about the oil spill is that the naval people didn't know that ice was coming in October. So while they were trying to figure out how to handle the oil spill, it didn't occur to any of them that ice came in October. In fact, a civilian who was there, who wasn't supposed to say anything, who'd been warned not to say anything. It was pretty funny. Went over to the submariner and stuck a little piece of paper next to him that said, "Ice comes in October." And because this guy was a civilian, the submarine officer glared at him, didn't look at the paper, and pulled the paper and put it under the table. And a minute went by, and then I watched him, and I looked down, and then he went like this to the next guy, and the paper started going around the table, under the table. Because nobody ever put the paper on top of the table, and it went around to 20 people, and then finally the officer running the exercise announced as if he just thought of it, "Well, when does the ice come in?" And there was an ice expert, and he says, "Well, it comes in then." And the officer said, "Well, would that stop our operations?" And the ice expert said, "Oh, yeah." And the Marine said, "Can we blow up the ice?" And the answer was no. So I learned that the Navy's taking it pretty seriously, but, and this is a recommendation that I wanted to make. I'll blow my last 2 minutes here, which is I really think that we've spoken about the Eskimos up there as if they're, related to the environment. We've spoken to them as victims. Let's talk about them as a resource for a second, because there should have been Eskimos in that room. The Eskimos would have known in 1 second that ice comes in October. And I would urge, and they're an amazing, amazing resource. They are great scientists. They're editing scientific papers. They have access to just the most knowledge. In the 1970s, when the International Whaling Commission wanted to stop bowhead whaling, and they said there were only 600 bowheads left, the Inupiat said that's not true, and the International Whaling Commission said, "What do you know, you're Eskimos." So what the North Slope did with some of that $300 million from oil companies is they brought in scientists, some of the top scientists in the world. And that county has terrific science department. What do you know? There was 10,000 bowhead whales, and the International Whaling Commission stopped the ban. There should be Eskimos in here now, probably. Yeah. And I would suggest to anyone in the audience who is in an oil company or an engineering firm or a shipping company or any kind of corporation that will do business in the Arctic, don't ignore the most fabulous source of knowledge that's up there, and it's the people.
Right. Jennifer, one last question before we go to final remarks.
Sure. A lot of people asked about Shell's recent performance in the Arctic, specifically looking back at 2012 and the ill-fated tow of the Kullik drilling unit across the Gulf of Alaska in December, which ended with it careening onto an Alaska island or running aground. So since you're only as good as the decision makers and the regulators who are watching, how can we be assured that the risk assessment procedures that didn't work that time will keep such incidents from happening in the Arctic in the future?
So risk assessments, Bob, or Jed.
Yeah, the real challenge for Arctic development lies in the logistics challenges. It's remote and it's complicated by ice. And if you look at the issues Shell had, I mean, they were related to logistical things, moving the Kullik rig. It's it's unlike the Gulf of Mexico in that you can't fly a widget out on an hour's notice, so that the logistics planning has to be perfect. Now, last year we drilled a 57-day well in a 65-day window without a hitch, but it took tremendous logistics planning. So I think that is the key thing, and actually working logistics for remote locations is the thing that is directly in the wheelhouse of the oil and gas industry. That's what we do.
Kevin?
Yeah, the incidents that happened with Shell had not so much to do with logistics. It had to do with taxes, because they were faced with the state of Alaska levying taxes on their assets if they didn't get them out before the end of the year. So what were they doing? They were rushing. Whenever you rush, it's cause for concern. And that's what happened. And that's the human element of what's happening. But it was a human element in response to a tax regime. And so that's really what happened. I think they would have been able to get it out there safely if they had planned it out, taken their time, and not worried about paying the state of Alaska what they were owed.
Bob?
There's a corporate cultural element in this too, because you're absolutely right about the taxes. And it's one of the things that I'm blowing all my recommendations. I'll pass the last 2 minutes. But I think there should be Arctic certification for anyone who is going to be working up there in a special program. Now, Shell is a company that rotates people every 3 years. So when I was in their office, pretty much none of the people who were there when I was there 3 years ago are there now. They're in England, or they're in China, or they're somewhere else. And I'm sure the good part of this is that a company feels that it makes its employees worldly, and you can operate in different places. But I think the bad part of it is that the people who are moved around and around come to regard every place as every other place. You know, I fixed it in Nigeria, so I can fix it in the Arctic. I know about it in Brazil, so I can know about it in Russia. And some of the people who were involved in those decision makers were not that familiar with the Arctic, and so I think we should look at the culture too.
I'll say that we don't know if Shell learned those lessons, and I think it's an outrage that the audit that was required by the Department of Interior to be done by Shell to learn the lessons of 2012 and be applied forward has never been made public. One piece of it was intended to happen on the grounds up north, one piece of it, Shell said they would only do that during the 2015 drilling season. So we're to learn the lessons of 2012, we're allowing Shell to drill again in 2015 without knowing how it took those lessons into account. And I think that's a government failure of pretty significant proportion.
Right. Well, Peter, you got the microphone there, so final remarks.
I awoke this morning to a beautiful view from my hotel room here on the University of Houston campus. It was verdant, it was vibrant with students walking around the campus. I texted a picture to my wife and kids. My older daughter, Ever the Alaskan, made sure to remind me that Alaska is 3 times the size of Texas. She wanted me to say that. So Marielle, there you go. That said, when I left Anchorage yesterday, it was 30 degrees, and it was 90 degrees when I got here. So you folks have 3 times our heat. Not a bad temperature span, right? 30 to 90. I'm not sure how much more heat you'd like to take. As an Alaskan, I sure like being cool. That's a pretty good sweet spot. Texas is a leader in the United States in alternative energy production. As rich as Alaska is in oil and gas, we are richer still in our alternative energy potential. And our remote villages are perfect incubators for microgrid technology that can change the face of energy the world over. So rather than look to risky energy sources to define our future, let's work together on alternative ways to maintain and enhance our quality of life. Let's work together to protect our current climate sweet spots. Let's do this for ourselves and for our kids. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now, Bob, you're going to defer, but I can't let you do that. Within your book here is some great stories about the intuitive knowledge of the indigenous people. I recall the one story there about the camp on the ice, and that they had to move. So would you please relate that story or another story?
In the picture in the mayor's office?
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I guess it's an appropriate story because Edward Itter, the mayor, had, you know, when you interview people as a journalist and the recorder is running, you get to pretend you're writing what they're saying, but really you're looking around the office to find out what things look like and describing what they look like and what sort of artwork and looking for something that might be telling of their attitude and a way to discuss their worldview. And in Edward's office was a very small picture that I didn't see at first, and it was a hunter on the ice. It was, you only saw his back, and the ice was just floating. It was a lonely picture. And certainly with the pressures under him to make decisions, he experienced those kinds of moments. But I asked him, why is this picture here? And he said, because he didn't pay attention for a minute, and so he's drifted off. And I think that was quite revealing of who Edward is, and I think it's certainly revealing of the burden that they carry up there.
Thank you. Kevin, final remarks.
I just want to say I think that the future is actually bright. I think we can tackle many of these problems, including climate change. And I was thinking about the Pope's visit today, because that's kind of been on my mind. I listened to his speech before Congress, and I was thinking a little bit about, one of the articles I read today was that, first of all, there's professors in this room, right? And do we know where the word professor comes from? Well, it actually comes, most of the universities were religious originally. And a professor was someone who, when I guess he at that time, rather than he or she, he would stand up and say, I really believe in this and profess this to be the truth. And so I think that's my message, I guess I would say to this group of students, professors, and even community members is that stand up for what you believe. You really are in this room. This is, grand central of energy here. There are some of you that are going to make some major decisions in your life for energy. I urge you to think outside the box, challenge the status quo, figure out some positive ways to move forward so that we're not polarized, and finally realize that technology doesn't solve all of our problems. And I think that's one of the Pope's messages today too. It's also, what do we want for our humanity and how are we going to move forward? So good luck. I'm dependent on y'all.
Thank you, Kevin. Jed, final remarks?
Yes. The world has a tremendous thirst for energy. I like to give you a perspective by talking about something that brings it home. One of ExxonMobil's largest projects right now is the Hebron field off Newfoundland in Canada, east coast of Canada. We're building a platform there whose base would dwarf Reliant Stadium. It's a massive undertaking. It's 6 years in the design and construction, and then it will produce for another 35 years after that. All total, it will produce about 800 million barrels of oil. The cost is over $10 billion. Thousands of people will work on it. Some people will spend their entire career on that project. And after 41 years, when all is said and done, that 800 million barrels will account for 8 days of current human consumption. That is what we are working to satisfy. There are 10,000 such rigs in the world's oceans today. We are not covered with oil spills as a result of that. We can develop these resources, and the Arctic resources will be needed because fossil fuels will be a part of a balanced, sustainable energy mix for many decades to come. Russia will develop their resources. They will be part of this sustained energy development. So the U.S. can either be in the game or they can't. I was involved with the first Russian offshore platforms. They had no offshore industry. It was U.S. and Norwegian technology that made those things safe and effective, and they've been operating for years now. If the U.S. stands in the background, Russia will move forward. And things will not be as good as if they could be if the U.S. had its seat at the table in the Arctic as an Arctic nation. I appreciate the attention of everybody tonight. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate all the panelists. So one of the takeaways that I have here is, and I thank the panelists for helping me in this, is that the future, well, the U.S. is an Arctic country. And that future of the Arctic will influence each and every one of us and in our future as well. So, Dr. Kay, I'd like to turn it back over to you. Final closeout.
Well, thank you so much, Rich. That was a terrific debate. Thank you all for participating in this. But we should thank Jennifer, most of all, for taking all of the questions and sort of putting it all together. So, Jennifer. We're going to thank each of our speakers for a minute. I've got a plaque for each of them, and then we're going to reassemble in the ballroom next door, where we'll have a reception where you can get a chance to meet with each of them, talk to each of them, and also partake in some drinks. We want to thank PKF for that part of the sponsorship and really appreciate their support over the years. So let me go ahead and thank each of our speakers here, starting with Jed and then with Kevin, and we'll move down the track. Thank you.
I didn't expect this.
It's something to thank you for everything you've done. Before we close out, I want to tell you about the next one. And the next one we've got is on November the 10th, and it's about carbon tax. Is it the right time? And that's going to be, I think, as dynamic as this particular debate. We look forward to having you there. If for some reason you can't make it, we have it live streaming, so you can also see it live on the videos on the web. So thank you all, and please join us next door in the ballroom. Thanks.